I'm Justin. I'm Scholar Communications Librarian. My pronouns are he and they.
I'm Sadie. I work IT in a public library, and my pronouns are they, them.
I'm Jay. I'm a cataloging librarian, and my pronouns are he, him.
And we have guests. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm going to introduce myself in my language. Halito Sahochifoyet Katherine Witzig, Chetasia, Oklahoma Atali. I just said hello. My name is Katherine Witzig. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I am from Oklahoma. My pronouns are she and they.
Hi, I'm also going to introduce myself in my language. Neat, MM, Simsianu, and Amherst, Massachusetts, Diwotsogu, Kitsikandi, Wawatsku, Ganhada, Ada Kitsalchach, Dipategu. Hi, my name is Brandon Castle, and I'm from the Tsimshian Nation, which is in the northwest coast of Alaska. I'm from Ketchikan, and I'm currently living in Amherst, Massachusetts, where I'm the Indigenous Studies librarian at UMass Amherst, and I use he, him pronouns.
Welcome.
Welcome. No, it's so great. I forgot to ask if you were going to do your introductions in your languages. Actually, something I wanted to ask from listening to the podcast you already did. When you're doing those sorts of introductions, is that something that, I guess, like, what's sort of the etiquette when people are like asking like to do their introductions that way in a group of like a lot of Indigenous people? Like how did that come about? How, like, is there a reason people do the go round in their Indigenous languages? Like, I don't know. I just feel like I'm missing some context.
Yeah, so I think part of it is just an acknowledgement that Indigenous languages have historically been not allowed to be used in educational or public spaces. So it's definitely being used in a reclamative way. And also, I really enjoy that when people are introducing themselves in their language, obviously there's some things that language brings to it, but you can tell a lot about a person by the things that they choose to include in their introductions. So I think it's a way to use the language in a reclamative way, but also really introduce who you really are.
Yeah, and I think too, like, there's abridged versions. There's like your whole family line can be included. I mean, you were saying like in groups of Indigenous people, yeah, people's introductions can go through their whole family line. So it's like, here's my grandma, here's my grandpa, my mom, my dad, my cousins. And I think a lot of it is just to really like allow, different spaces, especially Indigenous spaces in the community, just to allow people to know where you're coming from, who your family is. So that's it just brings that context to the relationships that you're in.
And I think that like sets us up nicely for what we're going to be like talking about today, like your work with Indigenous metadata, because like different ways and systems of thinking about how do you describe something and for what purpose, right? And like not to get like whatever the like Indigenous version of Orientalism is, so like not to get like Orientalist about it, but like just like what is it that different cultures, no matter where they're from, like what do they choose, like what do they value as important? Like sometimes when I'm doing cataloging, it's like when someone's searching for this, what would they use to search for it? Like what's important to them about this that needs to be in this record? And I think it's interesting how different that can be like across cultures and stuff. So yeah, like tell us what did you do? Why are you here? And what's the very cool thing that we're going to be talking about that you've been working on?
So the very cool thing that we're going to talk about today is for the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, they have a task group for metadata related to Indigenous peoples of the Americas. Yes, it's a mouthful.
They always are.
Always. But Brandon and I are co-chairing a group of 12 individuals who are working in libraries with metadata in the US and Canada. And there's also a split between Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks, but just a lot of expertise in this group to kind of look at what has historically been done for metadata related to Indigenous peoples and what can we do better. So we've got like a whole long list of things that we're responsible for, but we're just trying to look at, what we can do better and also take into account all these like local Indigenous solutions that
Mhm.
are happening, because there are some incredible metadata solutions that are happening, and I don't think they get quite the spotlight that they should. So that's kind of what we're about. We're trying to like put a little light on these solutions.
Yeah, I'm always telling people when I was at UIUC, Katherine, you were the one who graduated from
Yes.
UIUC? Yeah. Yeah, back when I was there and I did my thesis, all the research I was doing on like, okay, what are people doing with like community driven metadata? Because I was focused on like queer metadata. And like at the time, the only work that was being done that was even close to what I was looking for was all Indigenous projects, like Indigenous metadata projects like this have been sort of the forefront of this kind of project in a lot of like cataloging stuff for like a decade or more at this point. So you mentioned the program for cooperative cataloging, and the catalogers in the room know what that is. But we do have a lot of like non-library worker listeners, as well as people who are in library school or who are thinking about being librarians, and also just like all of our weird podcast friends that we make listen to this. So could you clarify what is the PCC? What is the Program for Cooperative Cataloging? What do they do?
So let's see. So I know Program for Cooperative Cataloging is an extension of the Library of Congress. And so they do a lot of the programmatic work of looking at standards.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the position that we were coming from. What kind of standards does Library of Congress have as far as like for their subject headings and for their classification schemas? I know if you work with Library of Congress, you know that Native American topics are all in E under
The
American
Indians of
history.
North America. Yeah.
Indians of North America are
Mm-hmm.
in E under American history. So there's kind of looking at that, how it's been relegated to the past, and ways that Library of Congress, as an institution that sets these standards for other institutions, ways that they can do better.
Mm-hmm. And how did y'all get involved with like with this project with the PCC?
I was actually on the American Indian Library Association listserv.
Yeah, I love
Um,
them.
oh, they're fantastic.
They're great.
I'll be the treasurer next year. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm really
Yeah.
excited. But they put out a call. They wanted people to like apply for it. So I know I had to create kind of a statement, a little bit about my background, kind of like what I would be bringing to the project, and then from there they kind of narrowed it down to the professionals that would be working on the project.
Very cool. And how about you, Brandon?
Yeah, it was a similar experience. I hadn't really heard of PCC because I was still, in library school when the call came out. But I think what really spoke to me was just that, an organization with such close proximity to Library of Congress was even like proposing that, this work is like of vital importance, and this is a call to, make a contribution. And, I personally do not really come from, a metadata cataloging background, but what I think is a really important part of this work, and I think PCC in general, is that PCC is also about like a lot of collaboration across libraries worldwide to provide like affordable but also like inclusive cataloging for libraries all over the place. They do a lot of work, and for me, I think it's really about that collaborative piece, and that's what I have brought from my previous experience was how do you navigate these different institutions, these different entities as Indigenous peoples, as communities like that have kind of I would say an interest and a need to connect with these different types of collections. So it's like, how do you bring that like community oriented mindset to this type of work? So for me, I was like, okay, this is a really great opportunity, and I really want to collaborate with people from many different backgrounds to focus on Indigenous metadata. So I was like, sign me up. Let's do it.
Yeah. So this kind of relates to a question I'll ask probably later into our recording, but something that I personally struggle with, like politically, is like why work with the PCC on this? Why the Library of Congress? Like, why do this through such like an institution as opposed to like another, like, not to say that it's bad, but like thinking about like politically why choose to do it through an institution as opposed to do it independently with another group, I suppose. Like, what was that? Was that like a decision you had to think through in your head?
For me, I thought about the way that it would be a kind of systemic change.
Mm-hmm.
And then also acknowledging that there are local solutions. My perspective is, why not both?
Right.
I think if we are going to have standards, which we are going to have standards, let's try to make them as inclusive as possible, but then also leave space for having individual organizations and institutions to have solutions that do work for them. So it is something that I thought about because, everything takes a long, long time. So that was something to think about as well. Like, even though we've been putting in a lot of this work, it's going to be a while before we can see the actual like fruits of our labor. So that was something that I considered as well. But I was really interested in having Library of Congress be more inclusive in a way that's not like, everybody's like Indians of North America and just like rubbing their temples. And it's like, that's kind of like, that's not a great reflection of like who I want libraries to be. So that's where I was coming from when I was thinking about like, should I do this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think similar to Catherine, especially, regarding like the systemic potential for systemic change. I know that I've seen advocacy like even before, going into library school to change subject headings, to like make this change in how people are described at like, what is seemingly like such a top level way. And another part of like the collaborative work of this is like just seeing like how many people and like different libraries have already implemented so much change, and being able to advocate for that and point to that this is a need. Because I mean, like, in some of the previous work I've done, that's definitely a barrier for so many different librarians, catalogers, where it's like, yeah, like we would love to do this, but like, we got to address the harm of what's already there. And then also, we're still kind of bound to LCSH, and we can't, it's not a whole lot of support, staffing, and just the ability to go and make all those changes. So it's like, how can we gather as many voices as possible, and people who are doing that work already locally on the ground, like how can we bring that more to light? And so that's definitely what I was thinking about, was like, how can we like, go up to Library of Congress and be like, hey, like all of this is happening and there should definitely be support and change like now.
Yeah, like I was on, was it the PCC? I don't even remember which fucking like ad hoc group it was on, but I was on it with Billy, who I saw was part of this as well, for like the gender and the name authority records, where we said don't do it. And I remember one of the things that was in response to was the first go around of putting gender in name authority records. There was a lot of good like scholarship put out about that, including that one, like the Ethics and Name Authority book. And one of my Homosaurus colleagues wrote a really great chapter, like criticizing sort of the way that Library of Congress Name Authority like views names and gender and relationships, and how Western, it reflects a very specific worldview. And one thing I'm always curious about, because I love this shit, is like, because Library of Congress like is structured a certain way and reflects a certain worldview, as you are adding and changing the terms to include and reflect better like Indigenous topics, like where that knowledge organization and ways of describing doesn't overlap well, like what's that been like how do you decide like when you do like endonyms versus exonyms, or like what language is used, or how do you make it fit together?
For me, I think about it a lot like weaving.
Mm.
So you've got the piece already there. You've got the warp and the weft and everything. You just kind of have to start wiggling things apart to make space. And that's the work of like, we are prying it apart so we can make the space to add those additional knowledges and those additional terms and those different ways of naming. And, while it's, somewhat unfortunate that we can't automatically put all these Indigenous languages in the authority files, I don't think that will happen. I think that the fact that we are getting the potential to include them or to just change these larger things, I think that we're kind of like tearing at it a little bit and making space for those Indigenous threads. So that's kind of the way I think about it in pictures. So
Yeah, I love thinking about basket, just like in general, but then also like for this, because it's such a good metaphor, especially like for other ways of knowing. It's like how to like things like especially like for Indigenous knowledge, you have knowledge that has been developed for like millennia, and then communities who have like disseminated that knowledge in like so many different ways. So yeah, it's like, how do you take something that is seemingly like it seems like there could be an easy way to just, oh well, that's how this group describes them, let someone just write it down, like whatever's the easiest way to spell it. But I think it misses so much, especially for how certain communities view the world, how Indigenous peoples all over the world have come to build these knowledge systems. And I think, yeah, it's just about like, how do we do that justice in libraries? And there's not always an easy answer. I mean, especially, for different groups. I mean, I can't speak for any particular group, but if like tribal politics can get really tricky. And then it's like, one person doesn't want it spelled that way, but another person, so I think I would say, just to answer like kind of your question about how do these two things overlap or how do you integrate them? I think a lot of it, to me, what I've seen is absolutely that, being able to build relationships over a sustained period of time with Indigenous peoples, whether that's through like certain collections that are in an institution or a library. Yeah, it's like just bringing people in. It's maybe easier said than done, but I think that relationships being built is a really important part of it.
I think
I
we
really.
also, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah. I think we also need to consider a policy of documentation and kind of the way that, we give priority to literary warrant, and kind of the idea that there is an origin point or person or publication. I think if we did a little more thinking about that and the ways that we can incorporate knowledge that, yes, has been developed over thousands of years, it's not going to have a single, like, let me cite this source. It's generations upon generations of knowledge. So, I mean, I think the policy of documentation is a great place to start.
Yeah, that's in the Homosaurus. That's actually something we think about a lot as well, is like literary warrant versus this thing could exist. So what if we made a term for it, right? Like this sort of almost like a making space for something for when it shows up instead of waiting, and therefore like kind of creating the world ontologically as it would be cool to be. I also really love that weaving metaphor that you use, because I feel like people view controlled vocabularies as this rigid, set in stone thing. And in certain ways, I think they are. If we get all like, critical theory about this, things are defined, but what they're not. All boundaries necessitate policing, all the things that we say on here every other episode, right? But like controlled vocabularies change all the time. Like terms get added, terms get changed, terms get updated, new relationships are formed between terms, like all of the time. There's a reason why libraries pay third parties to do all of their authority control in their ILSs for them, because it changes so often and it's a huge pain in the ass. Right? So like these things are living documents, they're living things, and sort of showing how like these things can change. They do all the time already. Like y'all aren't doing anything necessarily novel or unique by adding stuff to a vocabulary that gets stuff added to it. But I feel like people have this idea about LC in particular. So I really like that weaving, like pulling stuff apart metaphor.
Well, and I think it's really helpful to what you were saying about they have this idea of what Library of Congress is like, or kind of the attitudes that they portray. I think this work with PCC is an excellent opportunity to like potentially change some of those perceptions and, kind of move in a way that is being more responsive. I think in many ways it's still reactive because we've had Indians of North America for a very long time. But I think there's motion and movement, and I'm feeling that, and so I'm excited to like help change this kind of stagnation that they've had regarding Indigenous topics.
I tend to jump on the mic very quickly, so I'm just pausing, see if anybody else wants to yap, so I'm not yapping. Brandon, you mentioned justice, right? And I was wondering if y'all would talk about like the concept of justice within metadata. Like, is this work that you're doing a type of metadata justice? Or if not, like what does metadata justice like actually look like to you two?
Yeah, I think that's the question of all of this is, like how can we, bring to light these other ways of knowing in a respectful way and like in a, reciprocal way too. How can we like as information professionals be able to share, accurate, trusted information, but then also, allow Indigenous communities, people to have more of a control over how and where their cultural expressions, intellectual property, how that is stewarded. So yeah, I think this group is definitely touching on these goals. I think as Katherine was mentioning, like creating that space for this layer of justice. But I think there's a whole lot of terms. For example, in a lot of Indigenous communities, there are terms in Library of Congress. The broader terms are often misspelled. They're often inaccurate or not even from the actual community. It's usually more of a colonial perspective and description. So it's like how, where does the justice start? I think it's all encompassing, but it's addressing that harm. And that's part of what the PCC group that we're in is also working on is drafting a couple statements to include in what we present to the PCC and eventually Library of Congress is, the harm that some of these classification ranges have caused, especially what is it like E75 through E99, basically anything under the, the term, anything in that. I think there's a lot of need to correct those terms. And I think that's definitely part of doing communities justice for sure.
Yes, it is absolutely metadata justice. I think, especially leaning on the idea of reciprocity, if, the general populace as primarily English speakers would want information presented in a way that made sense to them, that they could read, that they could understand. Same way, Indigenous communities want to see their information represented in a way that they understand, that makes sense to them. So I think it's really trying to keep in mind that these are different communities, but they deserve the same respect as these larger communities. So I think it's really about doing what is right. And I think what's right is to let these communities define themselves and to use their own languages to describe themselves. And we should just respect that and use those terms. So absolutely metadata justice.
Hell yeah. And so one thing that I feel like sometimes people are surprised that I'm very critical about this is like, this gets me to think about like all of the like sort of reparative cataloging projects that have been going on for like a couple years. And you see them a lot with like people adding homosaurus terms, but then there was also the illegal aliens thing, and then people changing that. There's a lot of work where people will locally do stuff. And I'm often kind of critical of these projects, not because I don't believe in what they're doing, but because librarianship is still predominantly a white profession. A lot of these are very white projects, right? And I'm always like, well, did you talk to the people in your community where you're deciding what the right word is? Like, this was the whole reason behind my fucking master's thesis, right? I was like, have people talked to gay people at all when they decided that this word wasn't good for gay people, but this one is? Did they talk to a gay person? I don't know. And so I'm always like, what are they actually in contact with, like, these communities when they're doing reparative projects? Arthur, please don't get on my desk. There's a bunch of stuff on it, buddy. My cat's very like, I want to crawl all over your laptop now. It's okay, buddy. Come on. Here we go. This is Arthur. He's very sweet.
Hi, Arthur.
Kitty.
Please don't show your butt. There we go. Okay. And so, yeah, I'm always just like, obviously a white librarians doing reparative projects isn't in and of itself inherently bad, right? But I'm always like, what's the sustainability? Is this a one-time project you got a grant for, but that's going to end as soon as the cataloger who's doing it goes to another job, or the money runs out, or you hit a snag or something, or did you talk to people like at all ever? So, like, how can, like, especially like people who are not Indigenous, like, how can we, when we're maybe identifying these problems in our own library catalogs in our communities, like, how do we, like, work with, like, the communities in question? Like, how do we empower those communities who are not dominant in librarianship? Like, how do we actually, like, repair this relationship to make these reparative projects better?
I will say something that I have run into as an Indigenous information professional is sometimes you are the only Indigenous person in the room, and sometimes that's enough for some people. They've asked me, and that they're done. But I mean, there are over 500 distinct tribal nations in the United States alone. And so I can't be a representative of my own tribal nation, much less over 500 others. So I think it needs to be a constant conversation. And that also lends itself to the sustainability of the project. Because, like you said, if you're repairing those relationships, it's a relationship that should be reciprocal and fulfilling. So I think to start with, kind of think about things that your institution can offer to these communities. Instead of thinking about what knowledge can these communities give to me to make my metadata better, think about, like, oh, this is knowledge for which they should be compensated. They should be compensated for their time and for their wisdom. And I think there are a lot of people that forget about that this is still knowledge and expertise. So I think that definitely needs to be acknowledged, and that will help kind of treat it as like professional relationship, but then it can be like more than that. It can be a truly fulfilling bond if, like, you're able to consider these communities as communities of people. So I think that's probably like the first place to start.
Yeah. I really love what you said, Catherine, because I think there's a lot, it's every community that you're, that you're ever going to work with, communicate with. It's always going to be different. There's going to be different needs. There's going to be a whole different set of stages of where, work is at, especially regarding like cultural heritage things. I mean, a lot of tribes, nations, at least in what is the US, there's so much like inundation of just requests from all sorts of different things. So I think another component, just to add to what you're saying, Catherine, too, is like kind of that prep work, if you want to call it that, or kind of pre-relationship building, so that when communities do, come to a particular library or you individually, that there's at least some foundation, some scaffolding in the library that it addresses some of these concerns. Because I want to put a plug in for things like the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, which has fabulous outline for how to approach this work. Things from like building relationships with community, like how to make sure your collections are accessible and to communities, providing context for where your collections came from. Just general awareness of like Indigenous related issues. So that there's already this general awareness of that these types of resources exist that institutions can implement. And now that's definitely not always easy, because I think going back to what we were saying about being like a sole Indigenous librarian, it can be really, really challenging to have to continuously advocate for something that not everyone either A, understands, or B, cares about. Because there's a whole, depending on the size of the library, there's so many different things going on, and it can be a lot. But like for me, I would say that like tapping into the resources that already exist and framing them as a necessary component to do this work. Because I think a lot of libraries and things are really interested in DEI. I mean, we'll see what happens in the next year with all that, but it's like there's so much interest, or I think there's this like desire to have like a really shiny initiative.
We're doing the
like you were
good
saying.
thing.
Yeah, we're doing it. Yay. Oh, November's over. Okay, no more Native Americans. Like, it's like that's just 1 month. And I think like, for Indigenous people, it's like we're Indigenous all the time. Like it's happening all the time. So I would say that like, things like implementing protocols and framing those in a way that it's like, we gotta like implement this, because otherwise those relationships, those things that the library like wants to show are not actually going to happen in any meaningful way. So I think like seeing what's already out there in our field, because there is a lot of stuff out there, but it's about, just seeing like kind of how to implement and just raise, I think, general awareness is a component.
Which I think is terrifying for a lot of catalogers, since the stereotype of catalogers is that they're just like shut-ins who forget that patrons exist. All right. And like, I feel like this is so important to remember that like we're cataloging for people, right? And that like we are, like where I work, cataloging is part of public services, right? Like it's its own department, but it's under public services, right? So it's like I am a public services librarian, even though I do cataloging. It's that the whole like there is no such thing as like we're all front facing kind of work, right? And to also like forge relationships with people who aren't in cataloging and metadata, right? Like that's how you even start doing community building. Like, Sadie does IT stuff. Like, what are some IT considerations for like the various systems that might need to change, or like, maybe you look for a new system to accommodate whatever, right? But like you wouldn't know that if you didn't like talk to the other people who worked in your library. Like it's like step one, know who else works in your library and what they do and how their work intersects with yours. Like maybe you should do that first.
Absolutely, because that's knowing the assets that you have. These are efforts that we can all do together. You just got to know what you have already, what you need to go forward. And I think I think sometimes people forget, at least for me, I do work with the Oklahoma Library Association, and I do Tribal Libraries Committee. So I think sometimes people forget that Tribal Libraries Committee is not just about tribal libraries. It's not just an over there problem. I think the spiel that I try to give whenever I talk about it is like, we support Indigenous communities and librarians supporting Indigenous communities, which is everyone in the state of Oklahoma. Every librarian who works in Oklahoma is serving Indigenous communities. So I think it's not, even if you're not Indigenous, there are things that you can do to advocate for Indigenous issues and Indigenous knowledges, because Indigenous people have a lot to bring to the table. We just don't always get equal opportunities to do so.
Yeah, like so when I did a project with the American Indian Library Association back in 2018, and we did a poster about it at the Tribal College Librarians Institute. I don't know if you've
Okay.
ever been to that, Catherine.
I
Yeah.
haven't, but I've heard about it. Yeah.
It's cool, but like there were like things where you wouldn't think that's not a tribal college, like Montana State University, which is like where it was held. It's like, no, because like something doesn't have to be like on like a tribal land or anything to be like a tribal college or to like serve like indigenous communities, right? Like a state university of Montana was included in that institute, right? So I think that's a good way of reframing it, that like every library is serving indigenous communities, not just tribal libraries.
Yeah, and just to bring in my bummer drummer segment, if you go to a land grant university, you go to a university that is funded on the theft directly of indigenous people's lands. So go to, what is it, land grab?
Yeah, I think it's land grab. I can find it real quick.
Yeah, just so you know, that if you do go to a land grant university, no matter where in the country, that is based on the expropriation of land and sale of that land, and that's where your library, your university's funding comes from. Is the sale of land thousands of miles away sometimes.
Let's put the link in the chat.
Sorry, I just haven't been talking enough, and I'm like, oh, I think I know. Okay, because Jay does all the metadata nerd stuff, and I just jump in with the bummer stuff.
Well, I'm wondering, like, for our non-exclusively metadata people, and I guess, Brandon, that includes you, like, how does this affect your daily work as a librarian who doesn't do cataloging and metadata primarily? Like Sadie, Justin, like all of y'all.
I mean, like I did a project before the job I'm in now that focused solely on making a collection about Indigenous literature more accessible to communities, Indigenous communities more specifically, but also, the general public and researchers. And part of that was being able to include the nation that a particular author was from, because that's not something that you can just, take from, LC. That was definitely a local intervention. And I think that, for me, especially, wanting to build these relationships with communities, it's like part of that is being able to tell communities, okay, this is what is from your community. This is like what we have. Here it is. And it can be challenging to locate resources, especially if they are not written in the right way. But it can also be harder to find like more like resources written by Native people. So I think that was something that I ran into a lot was, people would, students would ask, where can I find like books on, the Navajo Nation or the Native people? And, sometimes it could be hard to locate that type of information. But I think being able to include that these like local author notes, I think really helped consolidate that in the catalog, and it made it just that much easier. So I'm like, if we can just keep this going, like add more accurate terms, like this would be even better. Because, people will ask me frequently for specific books by Indigenous groups. And sometimes, I really have to dig hard because there's not all this like different cross referencing and, these different types of notes that actually help tell who this community is.
Yeah, and I'm in public libraries. I've never worked in an academic library, so I'm not very familiar with Library of Congress at all and how it works. I'm just not an academic, but one of the libraries I worked at when I was in public service had a Native American collection, specifically because we had a library that was on, and the property and the building and stuff was Native, the local tribe owned. So it was part of their studies program too, because it was also a college. It was a whole campus. But I just remember shelving, and some of those Dewey Decimal numbers got so long because they had to get so specific across like different nations and whether or not it was addressing like the language or addressing the history or, whether or not it was an oral history versus like a written. So like there was just these like two shelves that were just like the first 5 or 6 numbers were all the same. And then it just got tinier and tinier like on the spine as it went. And I just think about that and how very little room that is in this giant wide system. And, this, and these two shelves were probably the only places that some of these books were. So they're skinny little things that are bound with the plastic, ring binding kind of thing. And yeah, so
not the
I'm
ring
thinking,
binding.
yeah, no, that was really hard to shelve. But I can imagine the ILL for some of these materials is probably nuts, because some of them have to be probably are very, very unique. Some of them are probably really rare. Yeah, I don't know. It's just the breadth of the materials I lost my train of thought. Sorry. But yeah, so I see what you mean, Brandon, is it's there's just very, very few sources of certain things. And it can be, when you're trying to acknowledge a very specific, local tribe, it probably gets even harder. And I was curious, because you guys are going to be working with metadata, and maybe this isn't a problem in Library of Congress. There, like you said, Katherine, there are over 500 nations. I was curious, is that just federally recognized nations? Because I live in Washington State, and there are several non-federally recognized nations as well. How do you reach out to those people to build relationships when they maybe don't have a recognized government, or don't have that sort of thing? What ways can we support those sorts of communities?
That is a really good question. I think something that can be really beneficial is enhancing your presence in the communities. I think that's always really helpful for starting partnerships and then building partnerships, because I think it's really easy to just, especially the role that public education and libraries have played in the assimilationist practices of the federal government. It's easy for there to be a mistrust of these institutions. But if these institutions are making a concerted effort to be a part of their communities, to build in their communities, then I think that's an excellent first step for building that trust. And I think it's just a part of knowing these Indigenous communities and just kind of getting the pulse of the local Indigenous community, I think will be really beneficial, because I know that I am in a rather urban area, but we flock together because we're creating that community. And especially when we are not on the land of our people, it's really important to find that community wherever you can. So if there are staff members who are Indigenous, that's expertise you can absolutely lean on. And then just kind of getting a sense of community events that are Indigenous centered, and then just kind of being in that space, I think is probably big first step.
Yeah, I think Library of Congress, they hired somebody to kind of oversee. Well, yeah, there's a lot that they're potentially overseeing, but I'm we're rooting for you, girls. But they, I think part of what I've kind of been hearing and gotten the impression is that, yeah, there's definitely a lot of different communities to talk to, 576 right now federally recognized, and then I think there's probably 400 plus, non-federally recognized or state recognized. Those numbers, up or down. But I think that, yeah, I think what Katherine is saying is yeah, I agree. I think being able to just get a sense of what's going on in a local setting, and being able to understand, who's what's going on, what are the needs, what are the different groups that are around, I think can be a really important starting point. But yeah, I think there's a huge. I think for that, the project that I mentioned earlier was that in this particular collection, it was there's all over yeah. I mean, there's so many different groups represented in this particular collection. There's not one particular focus. So, I mean, we could spend like the rest of our lives trying to map out all the different communities and languages and things that are here. But what we decided to do is like, let's actually focus on like where we are right now first. Like that's going to be the first like 3 years is just trying to understand like the scene in our area. What's going on, like who can we talk to, who can we meet with, like who can we just invite at the library, who can we go out and visit and see their communities. If, nothing to do with the library, nothing to do with our work, but who can we just like go and like see and like what's going on, like what are you up to, like yeah, like I think just treating it like that is really important, just like people. you know because I think that's definitely a big part of it too, is just like, yeah, really understanding like what communities are living, on a day-to-day basis, I think is important too.
And that's something librarians or library workers, no matter what their function is, can like do every day, even outside of like official grant funded projects or whatever. Like this is something we all can and should be doing all the time. Like whatever that looks like for our specific job, right? Let's see, let me look through the notes here. Sort of related to something we talked about earlier, but I think comes into play here a little bit, is sort of like when you are doing this kind of work, especially like the kind of reparative LC work, like when do you decide it is worth it to correct or repair this LC classification or subject heading versus this is better suited by another vocabulary? Because like obviously, like this is something in the Homosaurus, for example, like Homosaurus is not meant to exist on its own. It is meant to exist alongside other vocabularies like LC, and sometimes terms overlap directly. Sometimes they're slightly different. Sometimes they're reparative, sometimes not. Sometimes there's just a different angle to it. So like, how do you view sort of when do you correct versus when you think it's better suited to another vocabulary?
Yeah, I think just to just go back to the program specialist for Indigenous peoples that I mentioned that the Library of Congress recently onboarded. I know that was like a really big part when they were advertising the job, and now that that person is there, that's a huge part of it. They're like, we also need, want to know, like at the end of this, like, should we just pivot? Like, is, LCSH the place for this, or should we, transition to demographic terms? Like, is there a different place for this that's going to be more impactful? Or, yeah, that was one of the pertinent questions that I kept hearing, and I'm really curious to see like what's going to happen with that.
I think what's interesting too is that there is the question of potentially demographic terms, but these are independent sovereign nations, so they're also political entities.
Yes.
So that's another another element that kind of complicates that a little bit. I think there is benefit in repairing LC, but I am so strongly for local solutions to be representing these communities, and I would love to see some like larger just like indigenous vocabulary emerge that kind of maybe LC can take some cues from or something, because I think there's a lot to do. So I can see how that could be overwhelming, and especially with the kind of time that it takes to develop things at this larger institutional level. I think they have to work together. I don't think there's a way that I had a question when I was at the National Information Standards Organization conference that was related to like globalization. And I think that's it's a similar question of like, do we aim for complete standardization, or do we simply rely on local solutions? I think there needs to be global solution that is kind of a little bit more bare bones. and then the local solutions can like fill in the gaps and be the meat on the bones. That's kind of how I see it, especially because we have so many different communities and so many different knowledges. I'd love to see them emerge in interesting ways.
Yeah, this is what I think about. This is a long-standing problem in like archival metadata where there's a lot of local solutions, but then people don't share their local solutions. And everyone's like, how can we get, EADs to be linked? How can we do all this stuff? And I feel like I'm kind of out of the special collections archives game, so I don't know what the state of the discussion is. But I think with these extremely local things, there still hasn't been an entire solution to it. Although in the scholar communications field, there's just what I call like think locally, fuck globally, which is you get all of your you get all of your local stuff and you push it as far as possible. You don't hoard this stuff to yourself.
Yes.
Everything you make it reflects your institution, but you want everyone in the world to know what you're doing. Yeah. So that's always in the back of my mind. I never get to use that in like professional
That's what this podcast is for.
in like conference presentations, but that literally is how I think about it. It is just like think locally, fuck globally. Like you get it out there. And so, yeah, I think if there, I think this is a dual problem of very local solutions. And again, because like, all the different nations, the politics, I think one thing people need to realize is Indigenous people are people. And therefore,
Crazy.
I know, right? And therefore, just as unfortunately stupid as all of their Anglo counterparts sometimes, and like make things as annoying as possible. So there's not always going to be consensus on these things, and so there needs to be a way where cultural institutions can push out their data, and it's not just tooling. Always. It's sort of, I think a lot of it is attitude. I think a lot of it is, we're going to fix this locally, but who would care about what we're doing? And I think that attitude is the major problem because the tools are out there to push this metadata outwards. It's just, we haven't quite figured out or agreed upon how we're going to do that. But the tools, I think, actually are there.
This is why open documentation is so important, and cataloging departments should have like their entire, like everything online freely available to people except for private information. Because like, do you know how often I go to fucking Yale libraries, like little cataloging wiki, especially when I used to work in a music library? They got all their shit there. It's so useful. Like, even if it's only applicable to them, it's useful to see what other libraries are doing. Because it's like, why reinvent the wheel? You're not the first person in the world who's had to think about how do we implement this local vocabulary in this specific way or whatever. Like, libraries have done that before. We just need to be sharing our information with each other. Like, that's how I've learned most of my stuff. Like, what I know on the job is like finding out what other libraries have done when they post it online on their websites, or they make their like Confluence wikis public, or a LibGuide or something. Like, even something as basic as that, or like a GitHub repo or something is, I don't know, it's just really helpful in general.
No, I think that would be amazing. I would love to see just a way that we could just share all these ideas. Because I know, for example, someone I know from the Tribal Libraries Committee, they created a classification system for their library. They're just one public library. And it was based on the Brian Deere classification system that came out of Canada. So it's like,
yeah.
When we're sharing these ideas, we can come up with other solutions that can just incorporate these really good ideas. So no, I would love that.
Yeah, and on that of, again, just harping back to my point of, someone won't care what we do. One thing my library started doing is the posters that we make for various like months, and programming and stuff. They're entirely specific to our university, but we put them in our repository and they get massive numbers because other librarians are out there going, what can I make? What can I do? So even if it's entirely specific to what you're doing, if you just put it out there, people are looking at it. People care. People like this stuff.
That was my favorite part about for the PCC group. We did a survey to kind of get an idea of the things that were happening on the ground for these institutions, and just getting to hear about all these different cool things that people are doing. And, it's really helpful to have that kind of the survey as documentation of all these things. And then also we're getting to share that these bunches of people that fill out this survey also see that there are problems and we need additional staffing to address this at LC. That's how I frame it whenever I was talking about the survey. It was always like, this will help us as documentation for making the case for making these improvements, for increasing staff related to Indigenous issues. So yeah, the documentation, yes.
And because I know something that comes up a lot in what I've read and like when looking into this around like Indigenous metadata practices, the whole, oh, well, let's make our documentation public, information wants to be free, like that kind of very, Western librarian like attitude can sometimes conflict with various like Indigenous ways of knowledge sharing in an organization, especially that have like restrictions on who can view what. Like this was the whole point of the Mukatu like platform. And there's those, I forgot to look them up before the recording, but LC, like one of the Smithsonian Folkways, is using these like alternative knowledge labels as well instead of like Creative Commons stuff. So like in at least like metadata and like documenting these projects and stuff, like when you run into these instances where like how knowledge is shared and with whom conflicts with like Western ideas of librarianship and knowledge, like what has that looked like so far if you've come across it?
Yeah. So I've been able to do a little bit of work with some of those labels that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And one of the organizations, Local Context,
Yes.
I think they've been around. I think they, Mukatu, Local Context, but I think now there's definitely like they're garnering like a, pretty wide network of libraries and archives that really want to implement them. And the great thing is that there's like different stages of implementation. So, a library, for example, that I was at, we were able to implement what is called the notices. So not like a label, but these notices that come pre-relationship building or like formal collaboration with an Indigenous community, so that there's at least like this visible awareness within the metadata. And to even get that label in the actual catalog, I don't even know if it's there still. And that was like 2 years ago. So, it's like the compatibleness of these systems. But there's also, we were able to put it like on a website so that at least there's like this visible element to that, like this library is open to collaborating. And I think that's really important. And now that the way that they have it set up is that you have a notice and then a community can then reach out, and then the community decides what the actual label then is going to be. And you can look it up, localcontext.org. There's different labels, but I think that's a really great intervention, especially in the metadata world, where it's like, here's something that the community decided and wants you to know about this particular resource.
I haven't run into it myself.
It's coming.
Yeah, like
probably.
Like I remember when I was researching for my master's thesis. God, that was almost a decade ago. But like a lot of the studies and like published papers about this, a lot of them were coming out of New Zealand. Then like work with like Maori librarians and Maori libraries and museums and collections and everything. And that got me looking into librarianship in New Zealand, right? And they don't really have like the master's program and stuff like we do here in the States. Instead, it's one of those things where you have to like register as a professional librarian, like with their library association, like every year. And what you do to do that is you like map yourself against these competencies, right? And to be a librarian in New Zealand, like officially, one of the competencies you have to be able to map experience or knowledge of or plans to learn about is Indigenous knowledge organization and practices. Like, you have to know that to be a librarian at all in New Zealand. And even like at the federal level, like they have a lot of public information about how Maori intellectual property concepts differ from like more Western ideas of copyright and intellectual property, which librarians also have to know. It's usually around like licensing symbols and stuff. But like just how knowledge organization and how it differs is like something that like all librarians in New Zealand know, at least at a very basic level. And I'm like, that would be just so dope if that is just something we could barely just like, do you know anything? Cool. Like,
Right.
you know, like, and, you know, what if in every like library school, like in your library 101 class you have to take or whatever, there's like a day, you know, like bare minimum. Like, do people in library school learn about this stuff at all? And it's not always, I know in Wisconsin they have a class on it or like a specialty, but
I would have loved that. I feel like when I was going through the program, it ended up being the one Indigenous person in the class. So I get to teach everyone about being Indigenous, and it's kind of exhausting. It is exhausting, but it was very interesting to, have that kind of like motivation to frame all my inquiries in this Indigenous way, because it just wasn't happening elsewhere. So that was my schooling. I was just like, I'm gonna learn you a thing.
That's a major, my one big criticism of the UIUC program is that it just does not have any Indigenous focused stuff. At least it didn't when I was there. Whereas University of Washington's got a lot going on. University of Wisconsin-Madison's got a lot going on. Like, come on, Illinois, you're ranked number 1. Chop, chop. Sadie, you had something to say?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, I feel like that's kind of the boat that the land acknowledgement thing misses, is that it's like, it's the very, very start of, it's just, you have to know whose land you're on to even begin any of this kind of work, right? If you're going to do things locally. And then there are people who are like, what do you, even here in Washington, where half of our things are named like from like Lachute seed or something like that, like that nobody outside of Washington can pronounce. It's like, they're still just like, oh, wait, what do you mean? And I'm like, how did you miss that if you were born and raised here? Because like, yeah. And I was reading my local tribe's page on their specific land acknowledgement advice. And it's like, it's because they were inundated with people going, I don't know how to do this. And so that is at such a good resource to even start on. So like, I don't know. I've been thinking about this a lot lately too, because I've been actually digging through my local tribe's websites and resources and stuff. But like, yeah, the land acknowledgement thing is just like, people are like, oh, one and done. I did the thing. And it's like, that's so bare minimum. And yeah. And then you get into the, what knowledge does that tribe or your local community actually have? Like, do you know anything about that? So yeah, that should be, especially as knowledge, like information professionals, like that should be way higher up there than it is.
Yeah, Sam Popowich, who has been a guest on this program, once gave me advice on Twitter because I had, I was about to do a presentation, but I had seen criticisms doing land acknowledgements, especially from Indigenous librarians I knew and other like Indigenous like folks in my circle. And so I was like, I feel like bad doing this because like, what is my university actually doing? I'm just like, this means nothing. Like, are there better things to do? And one thing Sam told me that he did, like as a white librarian, and Sam's in Canada, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, Sam's in Canada, was like, instead of doing a land acknowledgement, like if he couldn't, like if whatever he was doing a presentation or something on, if it didn't contain anything about Indigenous resources or Indigenous people, like if what he was talking about didn't touch on that at all, then what would even be the point of doing a land acknowledgement if he wasn't even working on this stuff, right? So instead of doing that, he was just like, everything I talk about like has to be able to address this. Otherwise, it's just empty words.
Yeah. And materiality too, like where I live, the Istokana, the Carrizo-Comecrudo people, a tribe of Texas, not a federal tribe. Most of the work they do is about environmental protection. It's like natural gas pipelines, SpaceX, destruction of federally protected land, which is, as you might know, if you know anything about the borders and Native peoples on the border, pretty much every protection Native people have on law gets waived at the border. So like the graves protections, all that stuff that gets waived so that people can build walls and stuff. And so what I would always do is say like, hey, they're fundraising. Here's the link. I would just go into my university's, like, hey, we're going to learn about Indigenous People Day. And I'm like, hi, what's up? Here's the link. I'm putting it in the Zoom. Go put money in there. Do something, please. So if you're doing a land acknowledgement, be like, and here's their PayPal, and just hold up like a big QR code. I mean, like, seriously, like,
yes,
do something.
That's actually what they did at the Music Library Association conference a couple of years ago. They had a whole thing about sort of rethinking land acknowledgements. And what they did instead was they just talked about like Indigenous composers and musicians, both around St. Louis and in general, so that all of the librarians there could then go buy that stuff for their collection. And they were like, this is the title, this is the person. They even had some of the composers there to like talk about the works and stuff. But that's how I learned about like, there was an opera composed by a Native American woman back in the early 1900s that was performed at the Met. I was like, shit, I didn't know that. That's fucking cool. And then I went and like, I want to buy this for my collection and stuff. And we ended up getting some of the stuff from some of the composers there, like when, because I learned about them there. So like, that was one thing that conference did instead of like a conference sort of, oh, we're just going to do land acknowledgement. Like here's a whole session where you can learn about Indigenous materials to buy for your library. And I was like, that's fucking cool. So
that's amazing.
Mm-hmm. Music Library Association rules, actually. It's very cool. I miss it. I miss you. Let's see. Yeah, we've been going like an hour and a half now, so that we don't want to keep y'all too long. I guess, is there sort of any final like thoughts y'all had or like things you want our listeners to know? Especially, like I said, we have a lot of library school students or people interested in library school who listen to us. So is there anything you would want our audience like to know about the work you're doing or ways that they can get involved, like anything like that?
I think I would emphasize that Indigenous knowledge is land-based and it's relationship-based, and it has so much wisdom that it brings. So I don't think even non-Indigenous students should be afraid of, using Indigenous sources or just trying to credit Indigenous styles. I think there needs to be a level of advocacy from non-Indigenous people. So I would say have those conversations with Indigenous people that you know everywhere you go, because there are so many of us. We all have great things to offer. So, and we're people. So
Yeah, and I mean, especially in library school, I think I experienced this, and I'm sure many others have, where it's like you can tailor your assignments to your particular interests. And so if you're in a class and it seems like, oh, I don't think this could connect to Indigenous people, I would just encourage maybe how would this impact Indigenous community or Indigenous collection? That's what I did. I tried to tailor my assignments as much as possible to that. And I will put in a plug for San Jose State University. They do offer an Indigenous Cultural Institutions class, and it was
nice,
really, really, really informative. And now it's taught, I think, if not every semester, at least every fall or spring. So yeah, I think just being able to consider like how our work as information professionals, how it might impact Indigenous communities, whether that's through collections development, metadata, community engagement, just thinking about it holistically, not like it's some side project, but like how is it holistically in relation to the work that we do?
Yeah, and before I forget, I'm gonna speak directly to the white people in the crowd, particularly is think of what kind of, particularly, in the upcoming few years, what kind of white person do you want to be? Is the question you should always have in the back of your mind. Like, what am I doing? Because whiteness is constructed. It is a power relation. It is not your ethnic identity. You had an ethnic identity, and your family at some point gave it up in order to become white. Betrayal of whiteness is loyalty to humanity. So let's get that race traitoring going on out there. And so, yeah, I don't mean to derail or anything from the rest of what everyone was saying, but it was on my mind, and I think it bears repeating. Go read Noah Ignatieff. Think deeply about considering that this is librarianship, and librarianship is very white. Think very deeply about what kind of white person you want to be and how that reflects in your practice.
Oh, and everybody go and join American Indian Library Association. It's great. They rule.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, hype them up. They're awesome. Give them your money.
Yeah, and I think I got the traditional knowledge labels. Is that the licenses you were talking about with the Smithsonian? Okay, so
Yeah.
I've got that in the notes, so that'll be there too. Because
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that, because when you were talking
They're
about
very cool.
yeah, when you were talking about the Maori thing, because I've actually used New Zealand quite a lot whenever you talk about like intellectual property, because things that get trademarked have to go past like a trademark and branding board, and there is always Maori representation on there that has sort of like some veto power, which kind of exists in the United States in a very, very different way, in which like tribal nations own intellectual property on things, but it's not the same thing in which like they have a seat at like the copyright office or whatever to be able to say like, no, this is not copyrightable because this is traditional knowledge or whatever. So it would be nice if we had something like that. And I'm sure, but that's one of those instances in which like the government leading the way allows the profession. So it's one of those limitations of librarianship in the US.
Yeah, again, I learned about those at the Music Library Association conference I went to. Shouts out again.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, Katherine and Brandon, thanks so much for coming on. Is there anything you want to point people to? Social media, websites, anything like that? Or do you want people to leave you alone?
I mean,
So I'll probably share, I have a link tree. I have like my portfolio, and it has like my LinkedIn and also my art, because I do Indigenous
Yay.
beadwork.
Woo!
Okay.
Yeah, shouts out.
So yeah, I'll probably share that. And a quick Yako Kifena. Thank you very much for having me on here.
and yeah, I'd say, I liaise in my role as a librarian to Indigenous studies. I work, support Indigenous studies research. So if anyone ever wants to, talk more about that, my email is bcastle@umass.edu. But I think, I would also just like to say, Ntoiksit Newsome. That means thank you very much for having us. This was really nice to talk about with you all. So thank you.
So glad to have you.
Yay.
And good night.